Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our ongoing series of community conversations with the Vermont Sierra Club. I'm Steve Crowley, and I'll be mostly a silent host here. We've got a couple of great speakers tonight to talk about the dams on the Connecticut River and throughout the Connecticut River watershed. We have Katie Kennedy from the Nature Conservancy and Kathy Erfer from the Connecticut River Conservancy. And both of these folks are up to their ears in relicensing and other issues. So this is going to be a great show, and I'm going to pass it right along in a second. Let me say first, if it's great if, unless you're speaking, if you could keep your self on mute, that's really helpful. And it'll be Katie and Kathy pretty much for the first 20 or 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answer. So if you have questions, feel free to write them into the chat box, and we will pretty much take them in order when we get to that point. I guess that's it. I should mention that this is being recorded. So if you don't want your face on the recording, then keep your video off, and if you do want to see it later and share it, we will have this posted afterwards. So with that, welcome to everybody, and Katie and Kathy, welcome. I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you for inviting us to share. I'll start, and then Katie will take over in a little bit. So Connecticut River Conservancy and the Nature Conservancy have been working together with other stakeholders on this relicensing for literally the past, 9 years or so. And so we're going to present a lot of information, which will be so much that you're going to beg for mercy, and then we'll stop and have the opportunity to answer some questions and dig into more details where folks need it. So a little bit of the background, why do we care in the first place? There's a big ecological impact to dams in general, even and in addition to that, hydroelectric dams are sort of a special case. But so dams in a river do a lot of things to the ecosystem. They obviously block fish migration and block the ability of species to move through the system. When water's flowing down a river and comes to a dam, it slows down, and so it drops its sediment and then changes the bottom habitat in the area above the dam as opposed to the habitat below the dam. And so you end up having sediment accumulation above the dam and then not enough sediment below the dam in certain areas. So when you think of things like freshwater mussels and the little bugs and stuff, their habitat changes entirely. It decreases, water quality in some cases, and, can reduce the dissolved oxygen level. When the water slows down behind the dam, it warms up. So there's all of these ecological impacts of dams in general. And the dams we're talking about tonight have been in place for, more than 100 years. So a little policy background to sort of set the stage. The regulatory process that we have been working through is under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, not a curse word. And the FERC issues licenses for hydro projects around the country. The license terms for most of these facilities is somewhere between 30 to 50 years. And so the way CRC views it is the idea is that the companies are using our public resource, right, our public trust waters, our rivers, to generate electricity. And we essentially have a contract with them, the idea being that they will take care of our rivers. And we have the opportunity, literally once in a lifetime, 30, 40, 50 years, depending on the license term, to revisit that contract and check in to make sure that that operation is still a good use of the river and the river is being treated well. in that exchange. So the facilities that are under consideration right now, their last license update was in 1979. I was 10, and I now have an 11-year-old, so I'm sort of priming him to be ready for the next go round 40 years from now. FERC was created by essentially the Federal Power Act, and under the Federal Power Act, these facilities are supposed to give equal consideration to a bunch of different things, to power and development, to considerations of energy conservation, to the ongoing responsibility of protecting fish and wildlife species, to providing recreation, and then the preservation of other aspects of environmental quality. So water quality, aesthetic quality, things like that. And so another way to think about this really is the FERC as a federal commission has to be set on balance, on par with our other federal laws that come into play. And so some of the other considerations in this relicensing have to do with the state's role in the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, which sort of looks at cumulative effects, the National Historic Preservation Act, and our federal and nation's desires for recreational access. And all of these are supposed to be held kind of in balance with each other as this process, as you go through the process. So the dams that we're considering and have been working on are Wilder Dam in Wilder, Vermont, which is just over by kind of White River Junction area, the Bellows Falls Dam in Bellows Falls, Vernon Dam in Vernon. These three facilities are owned by a company named Great River Hydro. For many years, they were owned by TransCanada. And you may remember there was a point of time when the state was considering buying these facilities and they chose not to. And so bundled in this relicensing at the same time are two additional facilities in Massachusetts, the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility and the Turner's Falls Dam. Both of these are owned by a company called First Light, which is a Canadian investment firm. And so for tonight, because we are, focused on Vermont at the moment, we will just be speaking about the three projects owned by Great River Hydro. But I'll also say, that Great River Hydro owns other hydroelectric dams further north on the Connecticut River around the 15-Mile Falls dams, which are located further up, Newberry, further up in the watershed. And then they also own the Deerfield River dams on the Deerfield in southeastern Vermont. So a little bit about Great River Hydro. Great River Hydro is a new LLC that was developed in, I think, about 2017. TransCanada sold these three facilities to this parent company, which is an investment firm out of Boston called ArcLight. And so Great River Hydro is one of the LLCs essentially owned by ArcLight. And ArcLight is a private asset equity firm. So the bottom line here is that these are traded assets that are supposed to be making money for their investors. And part of what we want to cover tonight, where we are in this relicensing process, is we're kind of coming to the end and some decisions have been made that we want to help folks understand, and we also additionally have concerns that we want help people to understand that as well. So you have to understand a little bit about how these facilities have been functioning for the past 40 years. And so this graph here aims to try to explain this a little bit. These have been hydro peaking hydro dams. So what that means is that, over the course of the day, they would allow the water to essentially, come downstream, and then it would fill the impoundment behind the dam. And then once you sort of hit around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, when electricity rates go up, that's when these facilities would start to generate, and they would, ramp up suddenly to turn all of their turbines on, essentially, and then start to move water through the system. And as they did that, the surface water elevation behind the dam would drop. And so that occurred daily over the past 40 to 50 years with, a 2 to 3 foot on average surface water elevation change behind the dam. So you can see that that would have some effects on the stream banks in terms of, how they get saturated and then empty again. There are considerations of like dragonflies who are, need that stream bank in order to reproduce and have their young, come out of the shell, and they need to not be inundated. There's considerations of like dwarf wedge mussels, and, when they burrow in the substrate, if the water goes down and exposes them, or if it stays above. So there's a lot of habitat concerns about that surface water elevation, in addition to concerns about erosion along the stream banks. This graph here is showing 3 areas of the Bellows Falls impoundment. So you could think of that between Bellows Falls and, sort of around Windsor, Vermont. The blue line is the area furthest north in the impoundment. So if you think of the impoundment, it's kind of like the bathtub behind Bellows Falls Dam, right? Or, upstream of Bellows Falls Dam. So the blue line is kind of one end of the bathtub, and then the red is more in the middle of the impoundment. The green line would be right up close to the dam. And so you can see that the way that when the water moves through the system, it has surface water elevation changes occurring in different ways at different points in the impoundment. And this goes, sort of daily from June to August. We're just showing one, a few months of this as an example in 2014. And so you can see that what's happening is when the hydro generator is turning on, they're essentially moving a lot of water very quickly through the system, through the turbines, and then stopping. And then the bathtub fills, as it were. This would occur over the past 40 years, once or twice a day, where there'd be this situation where they would kind of go from no flow to a huge amount of flow, back to no flow. And you would have these fluctuations in the impoundment area. So I'll pass it off to Katie here to talk about, where we started in this process.
Hey everybody, good to be here. Thanks so much to the Vermont Sierra Club for having us. Just a little bit about myself. I have been working on this project since October 2012 when it started. That's when shortly before that, I joined the Nature Conservancy. I'm a river scientist. My background is in river ecology and management and decision science. So this kind of project is one of my favorite kinds, where we work together to figure out solutions to kind of complex problems. So we started the relicensing back, as I said, in October 2012. FERC relicensing processes start with a scoping process. What are the issues? Asking all the stakeholders. And then there's about 2+ years of studies. I say plus because lots of things happened. So there were some issues. Remember Vermont Yankee, it closed. They needed to delay studies because the baseline shifted, basically. We had some government shutdowns in there, and then some of the studies needed to be redone. So this process is supposed to take 5 to 5.5 years. It's taken we're like a little over halfway. No, we've got maybe 3 years left, I think, now after almost 9. And back in March, there was a working group. So Kathy and I were members of that, and we were kind of in this position of feeling like we weren't really making progress. So we kind of went back and got together to think about this idea of flexibility that Great River Hydro had been talking about so much. And we came back to them with some ideas for what we thought flexibility meant and how we might think about flexibility and how we could potentially find ways to meet some of these needs while meeting our needs with the river ecosystem. And so Great River Hydro, I think, took the initiative after that to begin some discussions with us. And we started speaking with them, having discussions with them beginning in June, and we completed it in November of this year. And we think we have a pretty good solution that we'll talk to you about in a minute. So when we entered these discussions, we tried to get some real clarity around what resource concerns were of issue. And so on our part, this was the Aquatic Resource Working Group. So we were really focused on the critters that are in the river. So thinking about fish spawning, success and movement, and the availability of habitat and the persistence of that habitat, which is critical in a hydro peaking system. And so we're looking at, fish species, cobblestone tiger beetles, charismatic microfauna, I guess, and dwarf wedge mussel, which is at both the federal and state listed, and then the tiger beetle is state listed. And then for Great River Hydro's part, we know that they were interested in operational flexibility, but of course, also making sure they maintain project economic viability and then stay in compliance with the energy regulator. So this is kind of how we entered the conversation. However, one thing to keep in mind is, again, this was the Aquatic Resource Group, specifically a bunch of biologists and people interested in the critters. We were not there to discuss some other things like recreation, fish passage, which is a whole nother challenge, erosion, and cultural resources. So these are issues that we recognize we did not address, and so will still need to be addressed. And Kathy will talk a little bit more about that later. So one of the things the Nature Conservancy brought to the table was a model, essentially. So we partnered with USGS and UMass and the Army Corps to develop a bunch of models. This one was one that UMass helped with, and it helped us to see what current operations actually look like. And so this is similar to the graph that Kathy showed you. There's 9 blocks here that represent 9 different years. This is a season, so July to October, 9 different years, which is a critical season for some of the biota. And what you see here is those daily peaking operations. So these are the operations downstream of the dam. So the x-axis or the horizontal axis is time, and the vertical axis is flow, how much water is leaving the dam per, in this case, it's hour. And so it's what we call a very flashy system. So there's peaks every day almost, and then occasionally you see breaks where there's high water, and sometimes breaks, tinier breaks when there's low water. So in contrast, we also have a model that USGS did that estimates what the natural hydrology would have been without any dams or any water withdrawals or anything like that. And it looks very different. This is important, I think, in particular for understanding what the critters have evolved to. And while we know that it's something they've been dealing with a lot of what we could call disturbance over the past 40 years at least, and arguably as long as the dam has been there, so maybe 100 plus. But this is natural, and there's a lot of dams on the river, so this isn't a target for us. So we did look at one other option, or one other model, which is this one, where we look at which is maybe the best option, which is what would the river look like if what came into the dam left the dam. So we call that inflow equals outflow. Sometimes you hear the term run of river, but that can be misconstrued to be like a natural regime. There, like Kathy said, there's projects upstream. So we call inflow equals outflow just to make sure there's no misunderstanding. You can tell that it's still impacted with peaks from upstream, but not as extreme as under current operations. So this is kind of the frame that we walked into this conversation with. I think after many discussions, we came to a really good place. So we told Great River Hydro, we knew what we wanted, we knew the frame of what was possible. And in the end, Great River Hydro agreed to deliver that inflow equals outflow operation, that last one you saw, which we consider the best case most of the time. Which was a big win for us because that really would be the best case scenario. And there's a lot of other technical details that we kind of fleshed out in this proposal that we helped develop. Some of them focused on water surface elevation. That's what WSC stands for. One of the most central components of this is this flexible hours of operation, getting to that flexibility piece. So there's a monthly allowance of the number of hours that they can use that water to generate electricity. And then some other things are how quickly the water goes up and down. And then also, there's one more on here, right? Oh yeah, and then of course refill. So how quickly that impoundment will refill after generation. And all these things work together in concert to deliver the regime that we hope to see very soon. So Great River Hydro created, and I think the next slide is so they created some simulations for us to help us understand what these will look like. So this, I'm going to walk you through this. Is a lot here, but this is really what I think, honestly, this is what convinced me. So, and I can tell you a little bit why. So this is winter, which has the largest allowance of flexible hours. So this you could consider a worst case scenario. So looking at the bottom of this chart, again, across the horizontal axis, that's time. So in this case, hours in a February example. Along that vertical axis, that's discharge, sometimes referred to as Q or flow, cubic feet per second. And then so this is for the bottom piece. That red line is current operations. So you can see those daily peaks that happen as they produce energy. The green dotted line is inflow equals outflow. So what comes into the dam leaves the dam. And then the purple is the proposed operation. So if you look closely, you can see that the purple tracks the green line until there are releases from the dam, and then they refill the impoundment. And then when they do peak, that's their 65 in this case allowed hours for flexibility. A couple of things that we saw that were really important here was that increase in base flows, and of course the decrease in the peaks. And then if you look at the top of the graph, that's how it corresponds to the changes in the impoundment. So this is water surface elevation on the other vertical axis. So the bottom dark blue line is current operations. It goes a lot lower. The impoundment goes a lot lower and is a lot flashier, a lot more up and down than the proposed, which really stabilizes that impoundment and decreases the amount that it changes. And like I said, this is kind of the worst case scenario. And we did agree. So winter is more valuable to the power company because of how variable those energy prices can be. And then it's still important for the biota, but less important than, say, spawning season or the season for growth, the juvenile rearing, and when they're trying to get all the energy they can to make it through winter. And we really thought that those increases in the base flows would help them make it through the winter months. And so this is an example of summer. So this would be 20 hours. You can see at the top that water surface elevation is even more stable. And this is a wet August, but also that the purple line tracks the green line even more. So we were really excited about this to see how closely it aligned with the inflow equals outflow, and how small in proportion to what they usually do, those flexible hours would cause the peakiness in the system. So some of the things that we think will benefit, some of the benefits of this ecologically speaking and for the resource, that inflow equals outflow will really kind of stabilize the water, so the flow in the water surface elevation. The base flows will be higher, fewer fluctuations, fewer rates of change, and that really increases protection of habitat on the shoreline, which likely also helps reduce erosion, we're thinking, both in terms of the habitat issues and then also with upstream property values and upstream property. And then also there's a lot more availability and persistence of habitat, which is a big win for the ecosystem. And then lastly, it really maintains the ability of the company to support regional energy needs and demands. And in fact, in the license application that Great River Hydro issued in December, they continue to produce, or they continue to, the revenue is about 99% the same, so really close to being the same, and 100% same in terms of energy produced. So that is super exciting to us. That means that we can make these systems better without losing energy value, and that's a huge deal because this doesn't usually happen. So anyway, I think we can go on to the next one, Kathy. As we mentioned, not this only deals with aquatic resources, and there are other issues to think about, like recreation and fish passage, erosion and cultural resources. So we still need to be thinking about these things. And Kathy is going to go through what CRC is, how CRC is approaching these other issues.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So we were so pleased, and we spent an enormous amount of time in meetings with the company between June and November. And as we said, the conversations were very focused on this operational scenario, the details of the scenario, and the considerations of aquatic habitat. We were not able to have those kinds of conversations about the other considerations where there might be mitigation or protective measures. And we were also not privy to what Great River Hydro was planning to provide in their application. And so they had to submit a revised final application on December 7th. And I started combing through it after having such a good experience negotiating with them and coming to this agreement, combing through, looking for the additional protection, mitigation, and enhancement measures that they were going to put forward, and found almost nothing. And so that was kind of disappointing. And throughout their application, they were basically relying on this operational change as the protection, mitigation, and enhancement measure that they are offering, and are offering little else that was provided in detail in this application. So what they did say they would provide were maintaining 3 primitive campsites that are part of the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail. Not all of you may know that there is the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail is the idea being that you could paddle, do a through paddle down the whole river, essentially from, kind of wherever it's navigable up close by the Canadian border down to the Long Island Sound. And then there are, campsites and access areas as part of the Paddlers Trail that you can access from the water only. So Great River Hydro has been a partner in this project for several years, and they have already been maintaining these campsites. So what they're putting forward in this application is to formally maintain them. So from our perspective, it's pretty much status quo, and they were not offering anything else to support the recreation economy in the valley, support ADA compliant, you know, recreational access areas or anything like that. I'll go into that in a second. They agreed to operate the fish ladders at the 3 facilities from April 1st to July 1st. Currently, they operate them from May 1st to July 1st. So they're expanding the season a little bit to provide for some of the migratory needs of some of the resident species that move through the river to spawn. And then they also said that they would discuss additional fish passage requirements with the resource agencies, and then develop a programmatic agreement for managing historic resources, which ideally should have been done before we got this application. So, you know, we're hopeful that these things can be hammered out rapidly. And, you know, our understanding is that they may be working with the resource agencies now to come to some agreement about the specifics needed to support fish passage, but it wasn't included in the application, and that essentially makes the application deficient in our mind. So just a little bit more detail on these things. You know, Connecticut River Conservancy, over the course of the past 9 years, as part of this process, Great River Hydro had to do a recreation study, which, you know, CRC was, you know, found somewhat deficient in how they did the study. So CRC and the Appalachian Mountain Club both, you know, at 2 different points surveyed recreational users in the area ourselves to try to come to some understanding of what the users of the river identify as needs. And so we put together essentially recreation recommendations that we provided to the company, like a laundry list of here's some things you could do, and provided that to FERC to put into the docket. And so this includes things like, you know, providing for some annual investment over the course of the next 50 years to support the recreation economy in the Connecticut River Valley, you know, improving and making really truly ADA accessible facilities, you know, so that everyone can access the river. Improvements to the portage locations. So the portage around Bellows Falls is 1.5 miles along a state highway. And they are not putting forward any recommendation to attempt to fix that. The facility that is being relicensed in Massachusetts actually provides a service where, you know, if there's a paddler coming through, you can call and they'll come and pick you up and transport you and your stuff, because the portage is along there as well, to the next, you know, to where you would put in. So there are all alternatives that Great River Hydro could have put forward, and they didn't. And you see the other, you know, things here that we suggested: improvements to the fish viewing facilities and actually enhancing those educational opportunities. It's pretty nice at Bellows Falls because it's run by the Nature Museum at Grafton, but, you know, not so great at Wilder and at Vernon. Like the fish viewing facilities could be improved. So things like that are what we were looking for in this license. And then, you know, some of the specific considerations of fish passage are improvements at the Vernon fish ladder. The Vernon fish ladder is a quite effective ladder, actually. We have more issues further downstream and at the Turner's Falls facilities. So if we can fix that problem, we'll have a lot more migratory fish getting up to Vernon. But the fish ladders were built for Atlantic salmon, and they really need to be tweaked and considered for the other species of concern, which are American eel, American shad, and sea lamprey, and making sure that those fishes can find their way upriver to find appropriate spawning habitat. And then in many cases, find their way out again safely without having to go through turbines as they try to find their way back to the sea. So those are some considerations that need to still be hammered out. And then as Katie said, you know, our expectation is that with the reduction of the surface water elevation changes in the impoundments, we do expect that there will be less of an impact on the erosion of the banks. But But the one caveat to that is at the northern end of the Wilder impoundment, there are influences from the dams that are upstream. So the 15 Mile Falls dams, and that's McIndoe's, Comerford, and more, they continue to be hydro peaking facilities, and they will continue until their license comes up, which will be in another 20 years, 10 or 20 years. So they are still, flushing like large peaks of water down through the river system that will continue to possibly cause fluctuations at the northern end of the impoundment. And so we would like Great River Hydro to do ongoing monitoring at that, in that area, to make sure that the erosive forces are being reduced. And, the other really kind of exciting thing about this operational change is it's huge. You're talking about a river that has adjusted to having water flow through the system for, literally 10 decades in a certain way. And this operational change will allow sediment and flow to move through the system in under what will be like a much more natural regime. And so we expect that the river will adjust over the coming decades as they start this new scenario. And you could imagine like where the tributaries come in to the impoundments, the water stops and slows down. So if you have the water held back in the impoundment and the tributary is coming in, it hits that impoundment, slows down, and drops its sediment. And so a lot of the confluences of the mouths of the tributaries are filled with sediment. And we expect that the bottom habitat may change over the coming years. There may be, sediment may shift in the system. New habitat might be uncovered. And so there's a really rich opportunity right now to start doing, some scientific research and monitoring as this river changes over the next couple decades. And we would really like to see Great River Hydro support that in partnership with, maybe our academic institutions to look at that. So, as Katie said, we're still a couple of years out from actually getting this license. And we really need folks to engage and comment and put forward their thoughts about what they want to see for their river. And so the timeline for this part of the process is, the companies have put forward their revised or amended final application. There will be some back and forth over the course of the next couple months where FERC will require additional information. And Great River Hydro and First Light down in Massachusetts will have to provide more detail to FERC until FERC is satisfied and deems the application complete. So there will be a point in time in which FERC says, okay, we have the information we need to move forward with an environmental analysis. And at that point, there will be a formal comment period where people can intervene and comment on the full application. We expect that to occur sometime after May. And then what happens is, at the beginning, we had that little chart of the different federal laws. Well, the Clean Water Act provides for the states to set their own water quality standards. And so the states get to also have their own process to issue a water quality certificate, which is the 401, called the 401 certificate. And so what ends up in that certificate automatically becomes part of the license. So there will be an additional comment opportunity, and the states will carry on their own process of, public hearings and collecting comments for what people, think should be included from the perspective of water quality. And water quality can include a lot of things, including considerations of recreation, aesthetics, and things like that. So it's not just limited to like dissolved oxygen and how much nitrogen is in the water. And so, if you're intrigued by this process, you want to get more involved, you need help figuring out how to sign up at the FERC website to like be notified, I am glad to, walk you through all that over the phone. We really need people to engage in this process and make sure FERC understands that there's a large community of river lovers here who are ready to stand up for our river. And so our contact information is there. And I will stop sharing the screen now, and so we can answer any questions that may have come up. If I can find my cursor, there it is.
Well, great. Thanks so much. That was so informative. Remind everybody again, if you want to ask a question, just you can type your question into the chat, or you can just say that you'd like to ask a question and we'll get to you. We do have, I think there was a little back and forth there about the purchasing of Gray River Hydro, or how did they get the contract? And I'm not sure if Kurt got his question answered adequately. Justin was kind enough to share his experience there. How are you doing, Kurt? I can see you there. Do you want to expand on that a little bit, or are you all set?
Yeah, I was just curious. I appreciate Justin letting me know how or why the state couldn't buy it. And I was just wondering how a dam in the first place gets the contract to build on a river, and if contracts like that can still continue and new dams can just be built on the river.
Whole new dams in this day and age.
Yeah, it's a much harder situation now. So when you think about this, like most of the dams that were built in the country were built in a very short period of time when, when we really at the heyday of hydroelectricity, and when we started, expanding and needing more electricity. What's happening now? So many of these dams are, still in play. Many of the facilities have been there for maybe 100 years or something, and so they end up getting re-licensed. And the reason that the license is 30 to 50 years was because the initial reason was that that's how long you needed for a return on your investment. We're not so sure of that anymore, but the policy is still in place in FERC that that's how long a license is for. And what's happening now, on a more global scale is, we're not building new dams in our country. We are maybe, there's literally thousands of dams in the Connecticut River watershed in Vermont and New Hampshire alone. So there are dams in place, there are old mill dams and stuff where perhaps hydroelectricity might be developed on those dams that are already in place. But more often you have situations like what's going on in Canada, where in the more remote parts of the world, dams are huge, mega dams are continuing to be built. And then that electricity is being imported into the country. So we're sort of moving our impact out and putting it onto other folks, often indigenous folks in other parts of the world.
I think every now and then you do hear about a small dam, often one that's been around for a while and has fallen into disuse, where somebody might get the idea that they could turn it into sort of a micro hydro site, and which presents a lot of the same problems, but really in a very different scale. So we do see a little bit of that. There was a project like that in Bennington not long ago. We have a question from Peter.
Hi, thanks for your really interesting talk. I'm a Vermont law student or law school master's student, so it's really fun to see dam action, because we'd learned about it. But one question I have as a biologist, I always wonder how you prioritize fauna and biota in these rivers. So what I guess floats to the top, maybe figuratively, maybe literally, when you come to these conversations, and what do you have to ignore to sort of not seem like the over enthusiastic protector?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there, a couple of important points. One is we do often focus on threatened and endangered species, but in part because of the regulatory lever there. One of the main theories that we use when we think about remanaging a river is the natural flow regime. There's and so the premise is that there already are trade-offs among the biota in a natural hydrograph, because some biota like it when there's less water, some like it when there's more water, and that natural pattern provides the correct amount of variability for everything to thrive. You know, some do better in some years, wet years, some do better in dry years, but you know, it evens out where the community composition is, you know, in equilibrium. So we do think about that. I think when we're looking at a really highly managed river where we can't like actually implement a natural flow regime, we look at those things that are still around, and that we think that we can improve conditions enough to help them recover. Like in the Connecticut River, there's a lot of non-native species. There's only a handful that are struggling, but we think we can help them come back, so really focus on those. So and two of those are the not so mega and charismatic dwarf wedge mussel and cobblestone tiger beetle, but they kind of represent communities that could potentially benefit from improvement, and so we really focus on those. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
We go to Dennis Rajewski. Dennis, welcome.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the presenters, for the presentation today, but even more for your longer term commitment to this issue. I dare say those of us who've been involved in environmental issues for some time appreciate that activism. Thank you very much for that. Just a brief question. Is there any issue of the longer term viability of these dams in terms of their financial viability, or in terms of sediment buildup behind, or structural stability? Are there any questions about, hey, maybe this thing's going to need to be decommissioned before long? Thank you.
Yeah, we would love to, you know, that's something that we feel in all of these hydro licenses. There should be a decommissioning fund to sort of think about like the period of time when it may not be useful to have this in the river anymore. The way our electric grid is set up right now, these dams are actually really important to provide stability, and they generate a pretty huge amount of electricity. So, you know, I would say you would need to have several things line up at a confluence to create the situation where you might realistically say, could one of these come out? And we're not there yet. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the course of the next 40 years with the amount of, you know, solar and wind that's coming online, the battery storage that's coming online with that, and what, you know, already we can see policy shifts in the New England ISO and the other ISOs about how they are attempting to integrate and handle some of that greener energy. And so there is an argument to be made, I think, that depending on how the electric grid and the generation shifts over the coming, you know, several decades, that by the time we get to the next relicensing, that perhaps these dams might be somewhat obsolete, or, you know, there would be a real consideration that maybe they're not needed anymore. But for the moment, they play a pretty critical role in the stability of the grid. And so, yeah, that's a larger sort of federal policy question in terms of, you know, changing FERC's policy to actually really consider decommissioning, which would be a good thing to do. Also for the smaller, you know, there's a lot of the smaller hydroelectric dams are run of river. There's, you know, arguably less impacts because of their size and they're not peaking. But they can fall on hard economic times. There can be, you know, issues sometimes where you could make a strong argument that maybe, you know, one of them should come out if they're not actually really generating very much electricity, but they're blocking important fish migration or things like that. So it's always sort of balancing, you know, our electricity needs and then the needs in the particular situation of where the dam is. And that's another piece of work that Connecticut River Conservancy does. You know, for the dams that are not being utilized, that we call deadbeat dams or sort of leftover, we actively find the funding to take those out. So this work, you know, we sort of have our hydro policy work, but then also our restoration work to take some of the smaller dams out. I'm going to put my video off for a minute because I think my battery is going to die and just switch places, but I am still listening.
We'll know you're here. Good. So I want to follow that up with another question about long-term future of these projects. You know, our climate is changing. So I think of so many different ways that might make a difference, you know, whether it's about the hydrology of the watershed is changing, the temperature of the water is changing. In some species, I know that we see different timing, say for hatching or for spawning or for migrations. How does that figure into this? And given that these are a 34-year license, how do we know, or is there any way we can get a rethink in 10 or 20 years?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a really, really good question. I think a couple of things. One of the models that we had was a climate hydrology model. So we did get an understanding of what hydrology might look like in the next 50 years. You know, one of the issues is that the spring freshet, that the snow melt will be earlier and lower, which is probably the most critical one because of what you mentioned, that the timing of movement. And we did think about that a little bit when we were developing, you know, the recommendations and the proposal. But there's so much we don't know. And so, and FERC has not, this is one thing we asked early on, FERC has not been real great about integrating climate change yet into their licenses, but Great River is a good partner. And so we did have some clauses in there about consultation if things didn't happen like we were expecting it to, or if things change. And they've been really good about that. They do, for the most part, they really do want to try to meet their obligations and you know, help to create, you know, the conditions that are needed to you know, complete life history cycles and things like that. So we're hopeful.
Mm-hmm. It's good to hear they're open to it.
I have a question that I guess you'd call it territorial. I find it interesting that the three dams we're speaking about are all named for Vermont towns, Wilder, Bellows Falls, and Vernon. But as most people know, New Hampshire owns the river, that the state boundary is the low water line on the western shore. And so New Hampshire theoretically is the controlling factor. And I'm wondering, have you found any issues regarding that differential between, since you're dealing with a federal agency, but it obviously involves the two states, are the three organizations working in good order? Are Vermont and New Hampshire running into issues occasionally where New Hampshire says, no, do this, and Vermont says, no, we don't think that's right? How does that dynamic work out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say in this case, you know, partly the electric generating facilities, the buildings are on the Vermont side. But yes, both states have a say because of this shared occupancy of the river, really. And I'll tell you, if I find a propane tank or some other big tank stuck in the river close to the Vermont side, and I call New Hampshire for a hazmat team, they tell me to call Vermont. So that watermark was actually from before the water level increased in the dam. So the line is a little ways into the river on the Vermont side, as kind of just I guess a sort of a funny aside. But in this case, the staff, the agency staff, the Fish and Wildlife staff from both states have been working really collaboratively with each other. Both are planning to do their own separate 401 certificate process, but they have been communicating with each other and us and all of the various stakeholders very transparently, and have been really cooperative. We, they're for the towns of Vernon and Hinsdale, close to the Mass border, they're in this funny position because they are also impacted by the Northfield Mountain Pump Station in Massachusetts. And so what we've found is that I'm trying to be diplomatic about how I say this, the relationships and the communication in Vermont and New Hampshire, we're trying to help them be mentors for some of their colleagues in the state of Massachusetts who don't function quite so transparently.
How delicate you phrase things.
Yeah. So the 3 states, it's actually the 3 states in this case that are sort of involved together.
Who owns the upstream dams that you referred to that are still going to be doing their thing until their review comes up maybe 30 years from now?
Great River Hydro owns those as well.
Okay, but they're not involved in this because their current licensing is still good for a while.
Right. And there are a couple other, I think there's 2 other hydro projects that are in the main stem of the river, upstream as it were. They are essentially functioning as run-of-river dams, and they have no control over the water flow. So they generate electricity as Great River Hydro essentially moves the water through the whole system. So Great River Hydro essentially controls all of the water from Canada until it passes across the border in Massachusetts.
Well, we're about at the end, but I do want to see if you have thoughts about pump storage and how that acts as it's in Massachusetts, so it's a little south, but people talk about a great need for storage in terms of matching the intermittency of things like wind and solar. Do you have is that an additional challenge for you?
Yeah, so, and not for me, it's a challenge for my colleague Andrea, who has to who's our Massachusetts river steward. Yeah, the pump storage facility is, it's an abomination personally. Like, I think it's a terrible idea. And I don't know that at this point in time, partly because they're using a live river as their lower reservoir, right? So if you had something that was attempting to solve that storage problem that had 2 sterile water bodies, or there's a lot of different ways to do that don't actually involve living systems, like train cars in a pipe. I mean, there's other possible ways to solve that storage problem. So the scale of that project is pretty intense. And so for the folks who don't know, they're essentially, you could think of like a vacuum tube that's pumping water up from the river in that area up into a reservoir at the top of the mountain, Northfield Mountain in Massachusetts. And then they hold that water. That's the storage, right? Holding the water up there. And then when they get called on by the grid, they then put that water back down into the river, to generate electricity. And it's like a huge load of electricity generation. But the bizarre thing about that is that they use more, over the course of a year, they use more electricity than they generate, because the amount of electricity they need from other sources to actually suck the water up out of the river, up into the reservoir. And there's at the moment, one of the things they're proposing under this licensing is to actually put a screen at their intake to try to keep all the live fishes from getting sucked up. That's not going to do anything for the fry or the other small living creatures in the river. And the other thing that's pretty intense is that the volume of water is, on average, it runs at like 20,000 CFS. So if you think about how the river was flowing during Tropical Storm Irene, that's what they're doing almost every day, right? Sucking that amount up into the mountain and then flushing it back down. And so when they're discharging from the reservoir, it makes the river run backwards upstream to almost to the Vernon facility. And it also creates fluctuations, bank fluctuations of up to 5 feet. So the farmland in that area is just getting completely hammered. Like the stream banks are, they've tried bank stabilization projects, but they're all failing. So sorry, whole other thing.
Who asked
Well, glad
about
you're
the
paying
trade-off earlier? I think this is one thing we have pretty lively discussions about this internally at the Nature Conservancy, because we are working really hard on increasing renewables, right? To try to get more renewables and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And, for those of us who understand the impacts of pump storage, we're like, hang on, hang on a second. But I mean, it is true that right now that facility is critical for the New England energy grid. And so it's this fine line we have to walk at this point. And I think, thinking about the earlier question about decommissioning, we have to think about these problems in the time of these problems. So there's today and what we do today, and to mitigate the major impacts that these facilities have, but also thinking about, okay, this is fine for now, but we're going to need to think about different solutions when things change, when the energy market changes, we have more storage options, when we're able to use batteries, on the river and things like that. So we take the position where they're needed right now. So what can we do to make sure that they can still operate while, allowing the critters in the river to thrive?
Yeah. One of the things that we put forward as a potential study for that facility was to actually create a separate reservoir at the bottom of the mountain, so that they were using an enclosed reservoir to move the water up and down, as opposed to taking that out of the river. FERC didn't require them to look at that, and so that wasn't ever analyzed as an alternative.
Talking about need and demand, how much impact on, you're saying how critical the pump storage is for the grid. How much was the impact of closing the nuclear plant, and how does that play into this whole thing?
That's a good question. I really don't know. Do you know what that did to the grid, Kathy?
I mean, the nuclear plant did not occupy the nuclear plant function more like how a solar field would, right? Well, no, I mean, it functioned more like how a run-of-river hydroelectric facility would function, right? So once that nuclear plant was on, they weren't switching that thing on and off every day. Like, it was on, it was generating electricity, right? Like, it's just feeding electricity in the grid. Northfield Mountain was actually built to capture the excess electricity that was being put out by Vermont Yankee. And so Vermont Yankee was, in some ways, the justification for why Northfield Mountain, when it was built, was a good idea. So when Vermont Yankee shuttered and stopped producing energy, it actually has created a little bit of a question, for the role that the pump storage facility plays. And so they have actually been actively, and this is where I get to the edge of my knowledge and understanding, but they've been actively trying to figure out a contractual partnership with other sources of large generation to, maybe to justify their existence is too hard of a way to say it, but, to be able to store the energy that is being generated consistently by other sources. So I know that they had been, there was a contract with a possible wind farm off the coast where, they were trying to bid in to become a partner in that. In terms of the lost electrical generation from Vermont Yankee, I think I don't know the exact numbers, but my guess is that it's being replaced by the wind and solar that's coming online. Maybe not fully, but it's a bit of a trade-off. Vermont Yankee didn't play the same role as the hydro facilities do in terms of how they support the grid.
Do you see a possibility of having a solar panel set up at the pump storage facility to replace the draw of electricity they were getting from the Vermont Yankee?
They have a solar field set up at the pump storage facility, and
Pretty sure that's for
they just
looks.
use it to make more money. As far as I can tell. And in fact, that was one of our complaints in the application, is they didn't include the revenue from their solar at that facility in their economic analysis in the
You
relicensing.
would know it was just for looks.
Well, as usual, these conversations could go on for quite a long time. And I want to thank Katie and Kathy for joining us tonight. I hope people noticed a couple of links. The Connecticut River Conservancy website is terrific and has a lot of great information on it about this project. So again, I want to thank Katie and Kathy for joining us tonight. This has been a terrific discussion. I'm going to pass it along to Rob to remind people about some upcoming events. Rob, to you.
Yes, thank you all for this great conversation. I just want to put in our next couple conversations that we have coming up. And we have on the next Thursday, not on Wednesday, next Thursday, the 4th at 7 p.m. It's the Transit Equity Day conversation and our first ever Transit Equity Day Awards. We're going to actually hosting that with the Transit Equity Coalition from Burlington, which is organized from the local Old Spokes Home. Then on the 10th, we have Reversing the Rollbox, which is going to be a panel of Sierra Club national attorneys, and Rachel Stevens, who's an attorney for Sierra Club, actually attorney at Vermont Law School, but she's the chair of the Sierra Club board, the local board. Then we also on the 17th, Environmental Advocacy and Racial Justice, where we have another Sierra Club national person, Hop Hopkins, who's the Director of Strategic Partnerships. And we're going to include Lisa Ryan, who was involved in Rutland, is actually an alderwoman from Rutland and involved with a whole lot of other racial justice projects there. And then just added today, we have the 24th at 7 p.m. A new conversation about building electrification. So please stay tuned with us for those conversations. And any of our other future conversations are all listed on the Sierra Club website at sierraclub.org/Vermont. So you can join us for any of those conversations. But thank you all again for this great conversation, and we'll maybe have you again some other time, because obviously there's a lot of information on this, so we appreciate this.